Thank you. Today, on the 12th of September, we celebrate and honor the life of discipleship of Swami Kriyananda. And it's very important in this respect. We have these great masters which all of us revere and of which we too are disciples of. But what Swami represents is that ideal of when you have a great master, how do we be a disciple? And so what Swami is a model for each one of us that we can take as an inspiration to be able to express what he expressed in his own life. That is how to be a good disciple, which was what his whole life wanted to be. When Swamiji became or took sannyas vows in the middle 1950s, I believe it was 55, he took the name Swami Kriyananda. Now, Kriyananda, when I first heard that, and I was introduced to him, came to meet him, the first thing that I thought of, he took that name because he blissed through the practice of Kriya Yoga. That was my first thought. And I'm sure that had something to do with it as well. But I came not too long later. It didn't take me long to realize that he took the name Kriyananda very appropriately because it expressed who he was. Kriya, in other words, that word meaning action. He blissed through action, and that is what he expressed in his life. Bliss, but not any sort of action. You see, it was action as an expression of discipleship, how to be active in this world and yet to give every ounce of one's intention, of one's action, to give it to God, to give it to Guru. He tried in every which way, whatever came to him, to use that as an avenue of expression of discipleship. He said of himself that when he was in Self-Realization Fellowship, that he was like a creative volcano. In other words, he was full of ideas. He had plenty of energy, of course, going through him, but that energy expressed in a creative way, because he was, as we know from his life, he was a very creative man. But it would express not just in artistic creation, but ideas, ways, how can we express Master's teaching better? How can we find ways that to use, to reach more people? And so he was always coming out with creative ideas. Now, if you've ever been in an environment where there's somebody in your work environment who's a creative volcano, you know that sometimes they're not always to live next to or to be next to, because they're always coming up with something new, something creative. And I think sometimes that was how other people responded to him. Some of his peers responded to him because they saw that of why are you coming up with all these wanting to do this, wanting to do that? They saw that as an expression of ego. In other words, a person wanting to express their own self out through their ideas. But that was not the case with Swamiji. So and I think this, if I look back on some of the lessons that I learned from his life, and we must use these great ones as ways of what do they mean to us? What can we learn? And I think this is one of the things that I learned from Swamiji, and is that he used his life impersonally. But whatever came to him in his life, his enthusiasms, the things he liked to do, he did them with joy, he did them with enthusiasm, but he gave them to God. And there were simply avenues that he could use to be able to express his Guru's teachings, to express his Guru's wishes. And he had this saying, which he often said of himself, and he came to you came to learn as you came to know Swami Kriyananda, that he said, Kriyananda is just an event. I've learned that it's just an event for which I am responsible. You see, he looked at himself very impersonally. It was not something that was a personal desire with him. He said that he had actually a fault, that he couldn't help it, but that he couldn't overcome it, but that Master kept telling him, he says, you must take this very seriously, and you must take your role very seriously. And Swamiji said, I always had that hard time with that because I just couldn't take myself very seriously. And Master chided him about that and put him in various positions. But he says, I just couldn't take myself seriously, the positions that I found myself in, because I didn't feel like I was anybody. I was just nobody. He says, and Master chided him once and says, every army has captains and it has privates, and you must take your role seriously. And he was a captain. That was his nature, a leader, person with the creative energy, with the ideas. And Swami would complain. He says, but I wanted to be a private. I didn't want to be a captain. And he says, but that was his role, and he needed to take that seriously. But he did it in such a way, he says, I had to learn to act, but impersonally, and to not take it seriously. And then at the same time, now if you came to know Swamiji in his lifetime, I came to know very quickly and see that he was actually had two sides to himself. That he was, on one hand, he was very loving, very personal. He would take an interest in people's lives, but essentially he was impersonal. In other words, there was a certain removal, distance that he always kept. As Master had said, always remain in the self. Come down from the self to eat, to act, to relate to other people, but then go back, return to the self. And that's, in some ways, how Swami was. And a person, certainly myself, I don't know if everybody felt this way or had this experience, but I came to quickly know that Swami didn't like idle talk, idle chatter. At least with me, he didn't like. And I think I saw this with a lot of the others as well. In the early days, when I came to know him at first, he was very interested in what I was doing. For the first 2 or 3 times I met him. After that, and he knew that, you might say, he had caught me, he'd hooked the fish. That once he had under that, he didn't like to just small talk. And sometimes I would ride with him in the car. And when somebody like that, I sort of felt this impulse I should say something, I should talk about, and so there was this, and what it was is sort of an emotional restlessness and mental as well. And so I would start saying, well, Swami, what do you think about this? Or how about that? And I quickly learned that he didn't like that. He didn't like, and sometimes riding in the car, it was usually in silence. Sitting at the table with him, and it was silence. He used to actually, those people who were long associated came to understand that he would like to surround himself on the table mostly with people who would keep quiet, wouldn't engage him in idle talk. Because often he would sometimes invite somebody to be with him, to eat with him, or to have dinner with him that was a newer person, and then he would engage that person. But the other people he didn't like. He had a busy life, and he was engaged with people, and people were drawing from him. And so at times in his life, he liked to have it calm and quiet. So it soon became apparent to most people who knew him that when it came to his own life, he was very impersonal. But yet, when he came to dealing with other people, he could often be very personal. He took a personal interest in I think everybody who came into his orbit, came into his life, he was personally interested in them. And he would do what he could to bring out of those people, out of the people he met, he would try to bring out something in them. And so that it was, and so in strange ways, little ways, not strange, but just little ways, he would do little things. He would do little things that you wouldn't expect. I remember when he'd give you a little gift, perhaps. Sometimes he'd say, "Oh, I saw this, and I thought you'd like it." And he'd give in just out of the blue. He would give something like that. I remember when Sadhana Devi and I had our child was born. Shama was born. She was born at home, and the day she was born, it was a busy day, and right after, not too long after, just within an hour, a couple hours after, and we lived in a little place. It was a little inaccessible, a little difficult to get to, but there, knock, 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 and I opened the door. Swami was there. I heard Sadhana had her baby. Yeah, and he came, went up to our daughter, was in a little bassinet, and gave her a blessing. And out he went. That didn't stay to talk. I think he gave us a blessing as well. But that was it. And away he went. It was just. But I've still. Many years later, 40-some years later, I still remember that touched me, that he would think of that, because he didn't have to do that. He knew I would have gone. I was going to take Shama, our daughter, I was going to take her to him. But no, he showed up at that time, and he would do just little things like that. Our good friend of mine, you might have heard the story, but her name was Hridaya, and she was going through a very, very rough time in her life, in her marriage, in her work. Her husband and her had left the community and were going off and trying to do other things, establish a different life. Not so much at her wish, but at her husband's wish. And it was a very difficult time. She just had a new child, and she was living in semi-poverty. It was difficult for them trying to get started, and she was very depressed. And she went one day. They had a telephone in this little cabin, and their telephone was out in another building. The phone was ringing, and they went out, and it was probably raining because it was up in the rainy country in America. She went out there, she picks up the phone, and it was Swami, who never called her before. Picks up the phone and says, "Hridaya." And she says, "Yes, Swami, it's you, Swami." And he says, why are you calling? And because she'd been gone from the community for some time by this time. And he says, "Don't you think it's time to come home?" And she said, "Yes!" And they packed up and they left, and they went back. And then later on, when some years passed, and Hridaya and her husband split up, and the husband left. She was in a very difficult time in her life, and Swami calls her and says, "Hridaya, would you be willing to do something for me?" And he says, "What, Swamiji? I need a correspondence secretary. Would you come and be my correspondence secretary?" And she said, yes, I will. But of course, I don't know if Swami really needed a correspondence secretary, but she was at a point in her life where she needed to be the correspondence secretary. She went, and so it was like he had this element that he was very personal with each individual soul, but with himself he was not. But there was a message in that I took, as he was saying. This is something that took me a long time to learn. He would often say, he says, "I don't want." People often come, and he was self-aware to know that he was a creative man. He had a lot of, and people would try to emulate him, and that I felt that way too, and I wanted to emulate him, but the emulation should be spiritual emulation, not outward emulation, but nevertheless to be like him. And he would say, "I don't want people to think," and once he actually said it this way, "I don't want people to think they need to be like me." He says, "Each person needs to be who they are, not be like me in the sense of being a composer, a writer, a lecturer, an editor." He says, that's not what he was asking of people. He says, "You should be who you are, but you in your highest sense." And so he says, do what you are good at in life, or what inspires you in life. Do those things that give you joy in life, but do them purely. do them cleanly, offer them to God to be a channel. So he encouraged people to act. He didn't, he says, act, do in life. Kriya Yoga. He said, do in life, but in the right way, which means getting the little self out of the way. Blesi led off by saying, about martyrdom, about the spiritual life is about martyrdom. But what it is, it's martyrdom of the ego. And when that ego is offered up and martyred, then it's a life of bliss. If we can get rid of the ego and we can act in this life, don't be afraid to act, but act in the right way, you see. And this is what the inspiration that he gave to me is that we need to really, what we need to do is forget ourselves. Act in this, don't think in terms of I am acting, or I need to do this, or I need to express myself, I need to be this or that. We need to be a disciple. And a disciple is somebody who can forget their little self in the offering of that little self up into the higher self. And then we begin to feel a sense of joy. And this is how Swami was. He was, at least he was with me. He had that impersonal side, but yet and there were times in my life when I needed something, he gave it. He was there. He was always there for me. Now, interesting thing, I was thinking back on it today, and in all the years that I knew him, he never, except for the second time I met him. The first time I met him, of course, they introduced each other, and I said, I want to learn Kriya Yoga, and he told me some advice. And then I came back the next following week to a second class, and he said, well, how did it go? And I told him, about in terms of my sadhana. And he says, how did it go? And I told him, and he just, which was basically not so well, but that's what I told him. And he gave me some encouragement. But that, over all the years I left him, he never once again asked me about my sadhana. Never once. About my meditation, about my Kriya practice, nothing. He never talked to me about sadhana. If he did talk to me, it's the lesson or the things that he asked me about or encouraged me, or when my presence would give encouragement that I felt were important to him, was attunement. He talked about attunement, the necessity of loyalty, being loyal, and living more in the heart. Living more in the heart. That the first two, in the first 10 years or so, that was what 10, 15 years, that's what he encouraged in me. But then later, I began to take a more public role, you might say. I began teaching, and my involvement in the work was working with other people. And then he didn't really speak about those things so much, but whenever he would give me a little encouragement, he'd say, the heart, live more in the heart. But the other, never. Now, I think that may have also reflected his own life as well, because Master told him similarly, that attunement, I don't think loyalty maybe, because Swami was inherently loyal, but also he told him he needed to get devotion. And that's really what it was, to get devotion, live a balanced life, live more from your heart, he would say, and everything else will come. And he didn't have to perhaps say that other side to me, because that was my nature anyway, to be. Now, sometimes people think in terms of impersonality. To be impersonal is to be cold. And that, I think, was my failing a little bit, is I tended to interpret being impersonal as, like that, and it's, don't be that way, and to open up from this side and to relate from people from this side of the personality, from here. And that's I think the lesson perhaps his lesson, certainly is my lesson. And in that way, I think this is the way we become disciples. Is we're disciples. Is we have the duty. We must act in this life. We must act. We must. And he would say, don't be afraid to express who and what you are, and do it. And get out there and do something. Kriya, action. But action, turn every action that you can do into how can that action express Yogananda's teachings? How can it express that, what he represented? And that's what we can offer, and do it in the right way, and don't be afraid to do that. And even if you make mistakes, he says, that's all right, just get up and try it again, but get out of the way. Forget yourself. And that's been my challenge in life. And this is what Swami is sort of, just forget yourself and serve and be a channel for God, be a channel for Guru. And I hope in this life I can also be a channel for Swamiji as well. Many blessings.
I think I will just add something to and focus on one thing that Jayaji spoke about, which is attunement. But first, I want to just reemphasize that Swami Kriyanandaji, if you were to ask him who you are, if there was going to be any self-definition, he would say, I am a disciple of Paramhansa Yogananda. That really, in a way, as Jayaji said, defined his life. Many years ago, I was with Swamiji, and it was just my wife and I, Maria. We were in his apartment, and he had been having some very difficult health challenges. Ananda was facing some really serious challenges to his very existence. We'd had a very big weekend program that he led, even though his body was really failing him in some way. I forget there have been so many ways that his body caused him so much grief. And we were with him at the very end of the weekend, just the three of us in his room. And you could see that he was very discouraged by things and just the weight of everything. And my wife tried to encourage him by saying, oh, Swamiji, look at all the good that you have done and all the positive, and the books you've written, all the people you have reached, the communities you've founded. And she was naturally trying to cheer him up. And he was very quiet, and he said, I only hope one thing, that at the end of this life, I can say that I have been a good disciple. That was it. That was all he was interested in. And that was really, he was saying, this is the most important thing. It's not all the things that I do, the books that I write, the music that I write. And he would often say, as Jayaji said, each person has their own way of serving God and the Guru. For some people, it's just serving their family or cooking a beautiful meal or just being gracious. For most of us, it's not going to be writing books and giving lectures and writing music and all these things. And so this really is the essence of the spiritual life, is to ask, am I a good disciple? How can I be a better disciple to the Guru? And the way to do that is something that Yoganandaji emphasized again and again, and which Jayaji mentioned, which is attunement. Swamiji once said that we listen. He didn't refer to the recordings of Yoganandaji, but that's the only thing that we have of his, is his voice giving lectures and talks. But Swamiji said that when he was with the disciples, it was very different. He didn't talk about Kriya Yoga even, he said, or rarely, or meditation or their personal practices. He almost always only talked about attunement and discipleship, but especially attunement. And attunement, very simply, is attuning our consciousness to a greater power, the power of God as it comes through, as Swamiji said, the Guru is a transforming station, where the electricity can't come directly from the main power center directly into our wall socket. It has to go through a transforming station that brings it down to a level that we can receive it without getting fried by it. And the Guru does that. He channels the power of the divine, and the Guru is God. It's one of the beautiful things I've seen only in India. I don't see this in America, because I think sometimes Americans there's this expression in America, question authority. And Americans can be that way. I mean, they just tend to question authority, and there is a little bit of difference or separation from the guru sometimes as an authority. But there's also a tendency to see the guru as a person. And so in India, it's beautiful, where many times I've had people ask me, is it okay to see the guru as God because I don't understand God? And yes and no. Of course, the guru is God. Eventually, Yogananda ji said, pray to the guru, introduce me to God. And of course, the guru is God, and God comes through the guru. But it comes especially through this power of attunement. That attunement will take us all the way to samadhi bliss, to divine union. This is the example that Yogananda ji gave in his autobiography of a yogi. When he received the experience of cosmic consciousness, which he wrote about, he left the guru for some time, and he wanted to find God on his own, and he came back to Sri Yukteswarji, and just within a few days he was meditating. He was having a very, very bad meditation, very restless. His mind was all over the place. And that's the moment that Sri Yukteswarji called him, Mukunda, come down. And Master was meditating, and so he ignored the guru, and Sri Yukteswarji the second time, Mukunda, come down here. And Mukunda said, sir, I'm meditating. And finally Sri Yukteswarji says, I know how you're meditating. Come on, you're not meditating. Come down here now. And he did. And that was when he touched him on the chest and he went into samadhi. And you see, it was not his great heroic efforts at being a perfect meditator that got him to samadhi. It was the receptivity and openness to the touch of the guru at the heart center. And so we don't have to be perfect in our efforts. We do have to make the effort, but the greatest portion of that effort can and should be attunement to the guru. Swamiji wrote about doing this in many ways. I'm going to read a little bit something he wrote. People, I think nowadays we take for granted this discipleship ceremony that we practice together. But in the early days of Ananda, there was no discipleship ceremony, because when people came to Yogananda ji, they became his disciple, and he formally initiated them. But then when the master's disciples came along, Swamiji did not see himself as the guru. He saw Yogananda ji as the guru. So he did not formally initiate people as his disciple. And so there was no formal initiation for many, many years until he wrote this ceremony. And he also wrote a book that described the ceremony and invited people to take part in this beautiful discipleship ceremony, which we are going to retake here this evening. And this book is a very short booklet, and if you want a copy of the whole thing, you can email myself or Aditya or Jayaji, and we can send a digital version of it to you. But it was a strong exhortation and invitation to become a disciple of the great master, because you have no idea how this will change your life, becoming a follower of Yogananda ji. And the most important part of it in that booklet was attunement again. And I'll just read a few things from that booklet that Swamiji writes about attunement to the Guru. He says, over the years, I've made a few specific observations. For one, that those who serve this work selflessly are those also who gain the most from it. That those, again, who try to share with others the light that they receive gain more spiritually than those who keep it to themselves. As Paramhansa Yogananda said, the instrument is blessed by that which flows through it. That they gain the most who seek attunement with others more advanced than they themselves are on the path. And that they gain the most, finally, who realize that soul attunement with this path is more important even than long hours spent in meditation without the companion effort to establish such inner attunement. And he describes how to do this, how to serve the Guru, because again, we have his example, and we're not all going to be like him, as Jayaji said. One of the favorite expressions that I've heard him say, which I hope he forgives me for repeating this one thing so many times. But I heard him say it twice. He said, "To thine own funky self be true." And he was saying we can only be ourselves. Be yourself and let the power of the divine flow through whoever your own very own nature is. And you will find God through your own nature, not through being somebody else. And he talks about how to serve and how to give through whatever your nature is. He says the best way of serving the Guru's work is to be oneself, a transmitting station for the ray of light that his work represents. This one can be whether or not one ever teaches, or for that matter even speaks. It is a matter of consciousness, of radiating outward not only to other people, but to the flowers and trees, to one's work, to the very atmosphere, the blessings one has received. And so attunement, again, when Yogananda Ji was with his close disciples, this is what he talked about, was attunement. More than anything else, it is the way to divine freedom. The Guru will give us the power to become free through our receptivity, which again comes through attunement. Finally, I'll just read one very short thing that Swamiji said in my presence. I asked him one time. I was visiting him in Gurgaon, and it was very easy to feel uplifted and inspired in his presence, and to feel Yogananda Ji in his presence. And I was about to leave him, and I'd been spending a lot of time in his presence, and I was coming back to America. And I asked him, it's easy to feel attunement to the Guru in your presence. How do I feel that in my everyday life when I go back to America? And I'll read what he said, the exact words, rather than paraphrasing it. Swamiji said, "What I do is ask myself, Master, what would you do? What do you want me to do?" I ask both those questions. For instance, in writing the essence of the Bhagavad Gita, I feel a real joy inside, as if Master is saying, "This is what I want you to do." So it is not enough to just pray and meditate. We need to ask Master, how would you handle this? Also, I have found that mentally chanting Om Guru, Om Guru, Om Guru is a wonderful practice. If you keep that consciousness day and night, it's amazing how you can change. You feel more and more desire for God, more and more purity of heart, more and more dedication. That's what really matters. And so let's take this discipleship ceremony, this very blessed day, as a way of really reinvigorating our own attunement to the Guru, to that Guru as it comes through Swamiji in a very particular and very powerful way, and feel the Master's presence changing our lives, and trust in his grace and in his power, that as long as we do our part, practicing devotion, attunement, chanting the Guru's name, that in the right time, in the course of time, depending on karma or whatever, that inevitably we will have that experience of divine cosmic consciousness through the touch and the receptivity that we have to him. So Om Guru to everybody.